last week, a 3-year, $3 billion US dollar credit facility was approved by the IMF Executive Board, and a 600 million US dollar has been disbursed to Ghana.
So as we speak right now, Doc, again, help me out with some education that have we met all the requirements for this program, since or some are still being more of a conditional approval and certain things are supposed to be worked on and all the rest, or some will come in the second review and all the rest, especially with some who say that in respect to in Ghana, we're still working on finalizing the domestic direction program, also engaging our external creditors as well.
Let me tell you, all the requisites by the authorities and what was needed from the international community to be able to go to the board has been met, and therefore the board was able to approve the program request. But this is just the beginning. And as Governor Addison said, there is a lot of work ahead of us. This is a 3-year program that is very rich in policies and reforms with the objectives of restoring the macroeconomic stability, ensuring debt sustainability, and laying the foundations for a higher and more inclusive growth. So the work has just started.
Help me out for the sake of our viewers as well. So it's supposed to be a 3-year program. When does the program officially take off? Was it when the board approved it, or when the disbursement was made, or when Ghana actually starts drawing down the funds? So when the staff level agreement was reached and all the rest. Help us out when you talk about the 3-year program and when officially kicks off.
The implementation has essentially started actually when we were discussing the program that could be supported by the IMF. And we see already some results. For example, inflation came down from 54% in December last year to 41% in April this year. In terms of the milestones and the timeline, a program is designed to have a review every 6 months. This means that every 6 months we are expected to go to the executive board for approval of the review, and then a disbursement can be made. So in terms of the next steps, we are really looking forward to completing the first review, and that is expected to be completed, which means be taken to the board for approval in November of this year.
So, and there's some clarity that I wanted. So does it mean that the program took off when the board approved Ghana's program, or the program took off when the disbursement was made? So if you are doing in terms of the calculation wise, that should be the test. I hope I'm not mixing the jargons here. The test date or for it to be calculated going forward.
In terms of the formality, in a nutshell, I would say discussions with authorities, reaching staff level agreement.
Okay.
Getting the conditions that are needed from staff level agreement to take the program to the board. That's the official approval. When you take the program to the IMF board, it's approved, and each time you have approval, you have automatically a disbursement. And then you have test dates that are the test dates that you're going to be looking at when you try to complete the review. For example, in the case of the first review, that is expected to be completed in November, the test date is going to be end June. So we're all going to be looking at variables at end June.
Thank you so much for staying here on the AM show with me, Bernice Abubedu-Lansah. It's time for our first big story, and it has to do with the IMF conditionalities. A lecturer at the University of Ghana, Professor Jampo, has concerns about the conditionalities attached to that particular program, and he will be joining us hopefully shortly to share those concerns with us. But we've also been joined by Dr. Patrick Asuming, economist at the University of Ghana Business School. So if you may recall, we brought you a brief summary of the IMF conditionalities and what it will mean for you as a Ghanaian. So let me just run you through those. So there's a tightening of the wage bill, and which means that public sector employment will be affected. Then there's the Bank of Ghana's zero financing of government expenditure, which is that there will be no more financing of central government expenditure. Then there is the utility tariff adjustment. Electricity and water tariff projected to go up for effective June 1, and you may be aware of the PRC statement, which indicates that. There is the introduction of new taxes, and you know about those that have already been introduced. Those preceded the board approval. And then there's the tightening of monetary policy, which is that cost of borrowing may remain high. So let me just run you through some of the things that Professor Gyampo talks about in a post that was put out. And briefly, he talks about the fact that, and these are his views on the conditionalities, the measures that may impose some hardships that ideally should be endured with the understanding that we must all sacrifice in order to turn things around. They are measures that we could have implemented ourselves without receiving them as orders from the IMF, a sovereign nation headed by a regime that touts its credentials of having the men, should have known and implemented these interventions without waiting for the IMF to tell us what to do. Now, he's questioning whether this is a truly well-negotiated deal. He's asking if the IMF truly knows what is going on in Ghana, particularly on matters of corruption. Quote, "I ask this because in Ghana we are always caught in the quagmire of fetching water with a basket. Yet nothing substantial was said to help us check the leakages and slippages. Indeed, in the fight against corruption, the talk about the continuous implementation of a national anti-corruption action plan that exists merely in name by the document shows that the IMF perhaps is no longer a serious institution. This is because it doesn't appear there will ever be serious efforts at implementing the NACAP, and an IMF that does not know this is bogus. In all honesty, it appears the IMF of yesteryears is no longer the IMF we see today. They are no longer bold, they are no longer courageous, and they seem to be tacitly perpetuating a cycle of African dependence on the West. Otherwise, how and why were very low-hanging serious recommendations that would help us quickly turn things around overlooked? Is the IMF ignorant that we earn just about only 5% of royalties from our gold? Is the IMF not aware that we produce oil and yet earn only just about 13% of revenue? Why didn't they talk about we taxing the extractive sector adequately to raise more revenue for ourselves? Why were they silent on what we must do to stop illicit financial flows? Do they come from countries whose sizes of government are as bloated as ours? Were they coerced to keep quiet about the local and international calls on our government to downsize? To my mind, any IMF conditionality that is unable to answer the questions posed above is a mere propaganda that seeks to inflict hardships on the poor, make Africans dependent on the West, and cover up for leadership incompetence and unwillingness to sacrifice. Let the government be warned that Labour would resist any unnecessary imposition of hardships on poor people without palpable show of sacrifice on the part of political leadership. The IMF must know the Ghanaian is intelligent enough to know when a cycle of dependence is being perpetuated, and we will soon resist. If the IMF truly wants to help us, then they must be bold in telling us nothing but the truth so we can wiggle ourselves out of imposed and our self-inflicted hardships. An IMF that fails to do this will deepen the derogatory but sometimes deserving perception that reduces it to a spineless organization staffed by cowards, praise singers, and funful respecters of failed African leaders. Yao Gyampo is writing this. And like I mentioned earlier, we've been joined by Dr. Patrick Asuming, economist at the University of Ghana Business School. Thank you so much for holding on, Prof. I appreciate it. We just needed to set the background and the tone for this conversation. Now, this is what Professor Gyampo thinks. There were calls for government to downsize, especially when the domestic debt exchange program was announced and implemented. There were those who said that we cannot pay for the sins of the actions and inactions of the government. And so the government should have shown a certain level of commitment itself by downsizing and cutting down its expenditure. So we've run through some of the conditionalities, and also, some include deepening public financial management, strengthening state-owned enterprises, operationalizing our integrated tax administration system. But missing in there is the conversation about downsizing government. You've heard the arguments of Professor Gyampo, and I'm sure that you know into detail what the conditionalities of the IMF deal are. Do you agree with your colleague?
Good morning and good morning to viewers. Thanks for having me. So I think my colleague Prof. Gyampo has made some very valid and important points. So, you know, we have a fiscal problem, and we have to consider revenue and the expenditure side. I think that, I mean, if you talk about the downsizing in particular, I mean, yes, downsizing would have saved the economy some space on the fiscal side. But, you know, we can only downsize once. And then, you know, whatever gains we get. I think for me, the broader issue is the governance problems and the rampant corruption that we experience. I think that one is extremely important. And the worry is that you see in the IMF document, when you talk about the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan, it's referring to something that we started in 2014 that we haven't made too much progress on. So that simply tells you that we haven't really made progress on that front. Don't forget that this was there before we went on the last IMF program. And we are now going to a new IMF program, and the same things that we have said we will do, we didn't do. And I think that's where I find the criticism of the IMF by Prof. Gyampo quite valid. Because if you look at the new documents, some of the things that were there were things that we put in the previous IMF program that we were on. Now in 2019, somehow the IMF agreed for Ghana to exit the program when a lot of these benchmarks had not been approved, had not been achieved. And yet we are starting a new IMF program, and these same things are there. So you have to question why the IMF has overseen us, you know, putting things in documents that we don't do. And then it's led us to some problems. And suddenly we have to redo them under rather much harsher conditions, because I think the current IMF program that we are going to, in terms of the pain and difficulty that will be imposed on ordinary Ghanaian businesses and individuals, is probably the harshest we've seen in the 17 years that we've been going to the IMF. So on that score, I think it's definitely a valid criticism. And then on the revenue side, I think we know, and the president has spoken about this before, how much this country loses to illicit financial flows. So, you know, you would have expected that those are relatively low-hanging fruit that we should have spent a little bit more time on. And, you know, I mean, to be fair, the government has done some of the things we've discussed in the past, the exemptions bill and the property taxes and all. But there's still a lot of scope for the government to do more. Now, on this side, it appears that the government has decided to shift a lot more of the burden to ordinary Ghanaian households and businesses. If you look at what we have done to even get the deal, the domestic debt exchange and the difficulties that is bringing to the banks, and then you look at the tariff reviews that we've already seen. This year alone, we've seen the electricity tariffs go up substantially, and then also the new taxes. So I think it's a valid criticism to question how much of the sacrifice is coming from the government relative to the share that is being pushed to Ghanaians.
Doc, we've been joined now by Professor Gyampo via phone. Good morning to you, Prof. I appreciate your time here. And I've just gone through your write-up. I've gone through portions of it and shared them with our viewers. But I would like for you to tell me, in one breath, where you start talking about your concerns or the issues you have with the conditionalities, you state that these are things we could have, or decisions we could have made ourselves as a sovereign state without a certain order from the IMF. And my question to you is the issues highlighted that you would have wished for the IMF to include, like the issue of downsizing government and all, can't we locally once again begin to start having that conversation since clearly the IMF ignored it? Or is it a thing of trust? You don't trust the government enough to, even at this stage, be able to take that decision solely, even as we've received approval of the deal?
Want to talk about local pressures again, because we've had a government that does not pander to local pressures. If you talk about downsizing government, for instance, there's been international and also national or local calls on the government to downsize, but they've been overly intransigent. And my disappointment with the IMF is that these are officials whose countries do not have the size of government that we have. And if you could not look into the face of government to tell them that, look, also as a conditionality downsize, then I'm wondering whether they are cowards or they do not really mean well. Honestly, in my candid assessment, I want to believe that the IMF now is more interested in putting in conditionalities that would help it recoup or get the government to settle its debt owed to others and owed to the IMF itself, without thinking about how we managed to get indebted to them. And so it will help you to settle your debts and do other stuff. But the fundamental question as to how you guys became indebted, they are not interested in helping you to address, and how you can prevent in the future in incurring more debts. They are not also concerned. And if you are giving us assistance, then you should also be interested in the kinds of things that we can do to raise money, internally or locally. And you can see most of the things the questions that I put, I mean, they are not questions that are so hidden that couldn't have been anticipated and answered. For instance, I raised this issue of, from independence up to now, look at how much we earn from our gold that we extract. Just 5% royalties. If we are going to be begging money from the IMF, and our politicians, for whatever corrupt reasons, they are not interested in raising that kind of royalty from 5% to another threshold, the IMF could have pointed it to us and say, look, raise more money from your gold. We pump oil, we produce oil here, and we get less than 15%. It's about 13%. Muammar Gaddafi was getting 70% from the production of oil, for his country. So can't we, if we cannot think, and then IMF is also interested in helping us, can't they also say that do something about the money that you get from the production of oil, renegotiate to be able to get more? Can't they tell us? And in the fight against corruption, I heard my colleague say, the National Anti-Corruption Plan is a document that is so toothless, is so, I don't know, but it's been there in perpetuity for a long time, around 2014. And we don't see any proper, meaningful implementation of that document. And yet, the IMF agrees that, you guys continue to implement that document. So we are always fetching water with a basket. Why don't we talk about illicit financial flow? Why didn't we talk about that? Why didn't we also talk about then taxing the extractive sectors more so that we can raise more income from those, angles? We are not talking about all these things. And IMF is not helping it. And yet we see the IMF as saviors. I am not thinking that they are saviors. Per what they keep doing to many African countries, in my view, is just a practice aimed at perpetuating African dependence on the West, so that helping ourselves will not be option. but depending on them for assistance would be the way to go. But I think that our leaders should be able to see through this. If our leaders know and they will not ask, we the ordinary people will have to see through this and put in the necessary pressures on leadership to be able to sit up and act. And like I said, I know the IMF, their conditionalities will definitely have some austerity implications on the ordinary people. And I've said that, look, Labour will not sit down to endure unnecessary austerity conditionality when clearly you don't have a palpable demonstration of sacrifice on the part of leaders.
Prof, during the presser to announce the deal for Ghana, the IMF mission chief for Ghana, Stefan Rude, when he was asked about the sustainability of the program, spoke about the structural reforms which he was confident would lead us on the path to long-term sustainable economic reforms. Do you agree that the conditionalities that have been attached, some of which you highlight in your write-up, would lead us to that point, even if those that you have suggested were not included?
No, see, so those that I have suggested are mostly the kinds of things that led us to go to the IMF.
Right.
And so, like I indicated, the IMF is mostly interested in how we can solve a certain problem without being interested in how we got into the problem. And that is a very weak way of solving a problem. Okay, it's a very reactive and temporary way of solving a problem.
So sorry to interject, Prof, but talking about accelerating energy sector reforms, talking about structural reforms to ensure Cocoa Board's financial viability, operationalizing an integrated tax administration system, all these for you do not help in solving the problem?
All these things have been recommended, and because we have challenges in those areas. Now, the challenges in those areas mostly are as a result of corruption that we haven't been able to fight well. And so my point is that if you properly tackle corruption, now these challenges that have warranted the recommendations from the IMF would not arise or they would minimize. And so then if you want to really deal with the recommendations, first of all, let us look at what led the recommendations we made. The fight against corruption. The National Anti-Corruption Plan that we are touting or we are talking about implementing exists merely in name. And from 2014, we've not been able to make any giant strides in implementing it. And so it shouldn't have been part of even the measures aimed at fighting corruption. We should have spoken about more drastic measures of dealing with the canker. And then other things would fall in place. And so I think that the recommendations sort of pussyfooty the problems that we have, and they don't really address the core issues that will have to tackle first. We cannot always be tackling symptoms of a problem without dealing with good causes. And if we do that, then we would always be where we are as a nation. And so that's how come I am disappointed in the IMF. I thought they were staffed with genuine economists, who understand some of these things, and they would help us to address the real root causes of our problem. But like I said, it appears that, look, even if they understand the issue, they are still also interested in making us depend on them rather than depending on ourselves. And so the low-hanging fruit. My sister, I've been saying this. I'm saying if we are able to get the needed resources from our extractive sectors, if we'll be able to get more down. I mean, think about it. That doesn't make sense to you. You produce gold in your country and they pay 5% for us and they take 95% away. That doesn't make sense to you. You produce oil in your country. When we were about producing oil, we discovered oil in commercial countries. We were all happy that we're going to now be economically viable. We're going to be able to raise resources and all that. Then later, some of us told Ghanaians that we should learn to manage our expectations because our politicians do not mean well. And that's how come we are producing oil and we are just getting 13% from the ones. We've not been able to have leaders who would say, no, let's sit down and renegotiate this agreement so that at least we can up our percentage and our income from the production of oil. They've not done that. And an IMF that serves as a police officer and is trying to police us is also unable to tell us that, look, renegotiate to get more. Then what sort of IMF is that? An IMF that is interested in making us dependent on them. And that is who they are. And so it is important that some of us expose some of these things so that we educate and sensitize Ghanaians to be able to put pressure on ourselves as a people. That look, let's do, if we really mean business and we are serious, some of the things we can do them locally. And if we do them locally, we'll be able to be self-sufficing such that we may not need a new colonial attitude that is being exhibited by the IMF.
Looking at the point of dependence that is raised in your write-up, and even as you've just stated here, and the obvious problem of we not being able to take some of these hard decisions on our own, it appears that you're quite pessimistic about our ability to sustain the economy exiting this program so that we don't have to go back to the IMF again.
Well, I am pessimistic, but at the same time, I believe that when we begin to talk and sensitize Ghanaians to be able to put the needed pressure on government will begin to do the right thing. And if we do the right thing by correcting the local challenges that we have, then we can go places, we can be able to exit the problem and the program and maintain our economy, at appreciable levels, at levels that we all want to see our economies at. So the point is, we say some of these things not out of malice, but sometimes out of frustration and out of the desire or the need to get government to set up. Because some of these things that the IMF, has ignored, they are the things that we have been saying locally, and government is aware. And so why haven't these things been recommended or provided for in a conditionality? And I don't know how to put it, but the point is, it brings a certain hopelessness, but at the same time, I believe that if we really want to keep the needed pressure on our government and drum home some of these weaknesses and things that have been omitted, we drum them home more forcefully. I believe if a government really wants to tackle our challenges, they may listen and then do the right thing.
Professor Gyampo there, sharing his concerns about the IMF's conditionalities. I've still got Dr. Patrick Asuming, who is an economist with the University of Ghana Business School with me. And thank you for holding on. I appreciate it, Doc. So, yes, we know how much it cost us, corruption, I mean. But there are also those who may argue that many of our problems are structural, they're policy related. So, for example, the IMF talks about strengthening the energy sector. We've seen what the PURC has done, asking us to pay realistic tariffs for the electricity we consume. Just in the Business Finder today, the IMF is asking the Bank of Ghana to stop the supply of quote-unquote cheap dollars to bulk oil distribution companies, which was something that was implemented to ensure that, one, these BDCs can access foreign exchange because it was quite difficult getting it ready on the market and get it at cheaper rates, which then translates into cheaper cost of fuel. So do you totally agree that, without the conditionalities that have been suggested by Professor Gyampo, then the IMF is bogus, the IMF is not doing its job when it has put in reforms to help us organize and put our structures together?
To the extent of saying the IMF is bogus, but I think that, so there's a clear recognition that some structural changes related to our fiscal has to be implemented. And he's right that, these things the government were told these things even before we signed on the IMF program. But, the other side is that we can make all these governance changes. We have to understand that when we say there are structural difficulties, it's not just structural difficulties with public finances and governance. It's structural difficulties with how our economy looks and how the economy works, the real side of the economy. The fact that, we are increasingly dependent on the foreign goods and services, and we are not making any attempt to change the way the economy works. An economy that primarily, export raw materials and import manufactured goods. And even the raw materials, you see that over time, things that we used to produce ourselves, we are not able to produce ourselves anymore. And we are importing so many things. So there's that side. And then the policy angle, you have to think about policy consistency. So, the current government came in with those set of flagship programs, the Planting for Food and Jobs, One District, One Factory, the One Village, One Dam, which is supposed to fundamentally restructure the economy and build an industrial base. But then the same government also came up with policies that make it easier to import. So we've had those challenges. So for me, somewhat, it might seem disappointing, but somewhat when you look at what the IMF does, you understand why making those structural changes to the economy are not part of the program, because that's not what the IMF does. IMF usually help you to fight your fire. And then when it's done, what you do with that is what matters. So I think one part that is missing is making structural changes to how our economy works. To be fair to the government, in the 2023 budget, some items were mentioned, in particular to diversify the export base of the economy and to improve competitiveness. But when you look at what will be measured every 6 months to determine whether we are making progress or not, those things are not part. Even the much touted attempt to build social protection to the program, if you look at what will be measured every 6 months, those things are not there. And you get the sense that it's just been put there to satisfy people who are probably concerned that the IMF program will bring difficulties to the poor. So we have to question why, if the IMF really cares so much about protecting the interests of the poor, why isn't both the quantitative indicators that will be tracked as well as the structural reforms, which part is actually meant to address those difficulties? And then we also have to ask our government, if we really mean to change how the economy will work going forward, so that, when we get some macroeconomic stability, we build on it and change our economy fundamentally, why are those things not being tracked? So it just tells us that, we may well be able to achieve some of the conditionalities and will not necessarily solve the long-term problems of our economy.
But, Doc, once again, is it the job of the IMF to, for example, point you to ensuring that you have more revenue from oil, for example? Aren't we asking too much of the IMF in this situation?
Well, not necessarily. I think, so IMF has come as technical experts. If you look through the document we've signed, there are a lot of areas where they are going to give technical expertise. And in one specific area, they said that their technical experts have identified sources of revenues, additional revenue potential for the government. And those ones didn't really include much about how much we're getting more from our mineral and oil resources, and then also the illicit financial flow. So I think that is where people can legitimately criticize the IMF that if you are trying to help the government identify revenue sources, why did you leave those ones? So those ones are valid criticism. But, the way the IMF works, and, the IMF is not directly, it doesn't elect our government. So sometimes people even question, from a democratic and governance point of view, why our government is responding more to the IMF than is responding to the people of Ghana. Because some of the things that are in the document are things that Ghanaians have spoken about, even before we went to the IMF. At the same time, you see, the IMF, when they held a press conference, to announce the staff agreement, and some of the Q&As that came with it, they will tell you that they support the authorities' attempt to do fiscal consolidation. But then they will go ahead and say the specific mode in terms of the balance between revenue and expenditure is the decision of the authorities. So in particular, if you look at the document we signed, it says that the authorities have decided that the consolidation will weigh more towards revenue, and they approve or they support it. So that is the language that is being couched. So, if you take that language on face value, then it behoves on us as Ghanaians to demand of our political leaders, the people that we elect, to be more responsible to our needs than to be more responsible and responsive to the requests of the IMF.
And so in this case, I mean, it's quite a sad picture you paint there about how citizens' views most of the time are neglected, but those same views are accepted when they are coming from an organization like the IMF. And in fact, Professor Gyampo, in his write-up, indicates that these are reforms we could have taken on our own. You find that governments are usually torn between taking the most logical decision against taking a populist decision, or a decision that will, in this sense, appear to alleviate the burden of paying for commodities. So take, for example, electricity, and how over the years government has tried to subsidize, intervene, and so we have so much debt in that sector which we're yet to clear, and then we keep piling more debt. From the governance point of view, I know you're an economist, but bringing the issue of ensuring that your people are not burdened too much, and having to also ensure that you're paying for what you consume properly. It's a balance, isn't it? How do we ensure that we work out the balance in such a way that it doesn't get us to this point again?
So, when it comes to the energy sector, and I think first of all we have to understand that the difficulties we have with the energy sector doesn't come only from government supporting in terms of price subsidies. We know that when we were in some crisis in the past, we went to some deals that have come to bite us. But in terms of dealing with this structure, I think we have to have an energy policy that feeds into a long-term development strategy that says, okay, these are the sustainable sources of energy going forward. And then if we, think about an optimal energy mix, and then have something that we follow. Not that, sometimes we feel, I don't know, like you said, government respond to some populist needs and then decide to do something. We all have to recognize that there are some vulnerable people in our society that we have to protect. There's no two ways about that. So that's why we have the cutoffs for determining who can get subsidies and so on and so forth. But it's because we have been very haphazard in how we do a lot of our policies and decision making. I'll give you one example. I think it was 2018 or so when we announced that there was, I think, a 30% cut in electricity prices. And then 2 years later, first of all, we announced these cuts when we know that we are having to do these IPPs, and then we have this pay or take agreement that we are paying that is burdening us. So you have to question, what was the basis for that? Only for a few years down the line, when COVID strike, we now impose a new levy to come and address the debt, the public sector, the debt in the energy sector. So a big chunk of it is that we don't really have any consistent and, well thought out long-term strategy for how we deal with things. If we did that, then we will know that, this is in this particular sector, say energy, this is where we have to go in the long term. These are how we are going to address with people who genuinely have needs that they need government support. And anything else, this is the cost recovery rate that we have to do to ensure that, the sector is sustainable on its own. Unfortunately, we haven't had that, and that's why, what we call populism appears And then other things, and policy incoherence appears. And that's why we have been paying energy sector debt since I've been born. I think every year we have energy sector debt. We impose new levies to pay them, and they never get paid. So we really need some long-term strategy.
And what would that long-term strategy entail here? And you can go beyond the energy sector. What for you will be the clearest indication yet that we are ready as a people to get out of the mess we've created politically, socially, economically, in order to make this economy a viable one, and not only viable for a short term, but for a very long term?
So, well, I mean, that will take several aspects. It will have different dimensions. One, so you can think about the financing dimension, because at least it is financing that has brought us here. In my view, we have to understand that our over-reliance on foreign financing, foreign financing of all forms, some aspect of FDI, some aspect of domestic portfolio financing, it's not going to be a sustainable long-term strategy. And the idea that you just sit here and then borrow from the international capital market, well, we've seen where it has landed us. So I think we have to think about how we find more ingenious ways of relying a little bit more on domestic financing. At the moment, we can't say, oh, we are no longer going to rely on foreign financing. But you see, you have to say, which aspect of our economy do we need some financing from others? And not say, oh, we are just going to open our arms and welcome any form of FDI. So in the name of FDI, we've allowed some countries to come and set up shops to retail their, low-cost production from their countries where they have been subsidized. I mean, and then yet we call it FDI. This kind of thing doesn't really support any attempt to industrialize your economy. So we have to think about what financing options are available to us. Whether now we are going to restructure the economy so that we are getting more from our mineral resources, from our oil resources, from our cocoa, and then having to rethink whether we will change how we even finance the purchasing of the cocoa. Because it means that every time, a lot of the gains, a lot of the surplus that have been generated from our cocoa production are being paid out because we are always taking these cocoa syndicated loans and we are paying interest on them. Whereas if we had a strategy maybe 20 years ago that in 10 years' time, whatever surplus we are getting, we will save some so that at some point we no longer go and do this syndicated loan, then we will be able to keep more of the cocoa money inside. One thing we have to understand is this: no foreign investor is going to put $1 in the Ghanaian economy when they are not going to take out more than $1. So it's a cost and benefit. Of course, at the same time, we can't say you no longer rely on foreign financing, because there are some things that at the moment we just don't have the capacity. When it comes to having a long-term plan, then we have to think about the overall real side of the economy and how it is working. And then when we are building, for instance, so we might decide that we are going to invest more, first of all, in agriculture, to strengthen agriculture before we look forward to trying to build on agriculture and do more agro-processing. And trust me, all these things that we are discussing, if you go and check what our main political parties put in their manifestos, at some point in time, they are there. And that's why people bring us to the governance issue. So why is it that we have these ideas, we're able to write them down, and then we are not able to implement them? So what happens between the time you are in opposition and you put a good plan in place to the time that you are in government and suddenly everything goes out? And I think that is where our political scientists tell us that maybe we need more governance reforms, going all the way to thinking about political party financing. Because we've seen that it appears that there are people who invest in political party financing, and then when the government is in power, then they are forced to cut some deals that doesn't serve our long-term interest, because it's time for them to reap the benefit of their investment. So it's a whole, there are different aspects of how our economy works: governance, energy, forestry, everything that we need to rethink, and not just think that fixing one aspect of our economy will solve our problems.
That's a very interesting point you make, Doc, and I'm just beginning to wonder if we should run those reforms alongside this, the structural reforms that are conditions for this IMF deal, and whether that will propel our desire to get out of this mess faster than without running them concurrently.
Well, I mean, we are in the deepest crisis we have been since probably 1983 or so. And when you are in crisis like this, it's an opportunity for you to make changes. And the other aspect is that I've already mentioned that this particular IMF program has cost Ghanaians a lot. You know, even the prior actions that we've had to take in order to get the program has cost us a lot. And that should be the impetus for us to say, okay, never again. So whatever reforms we need to make, we can't say, oh, we are going to push this thing aside or wait for anything, because they all have to go hand in hand. So, you know, I think it's important that Ghanaians begin to engage and, you know, begin to be a little bit more demanding that if we are going to make these sacrifices, if we are accepting for our government to push a bigger share of the burden of this structural adjustment, these reforms on us, it should come with us demanding that things are changed, that the way the economy works changes going forward, and at the same time, the way our governance works, you know, are also changed. So it's really on us, because as the discussion has shown, we can't expect that the IMF will come and force our government to do all the structural changes, all the difficult things that it doesn't want to do. If you look at the document, and then even from the last IMF program to now, it tells us that there are a lot of things that even the relationship with the IMF will not make us do. It behoves on Ghanaians to be a little bit more demanding, a little bit more engaging, and say that no, you don't want these things again. If you are paying these hefty prices, things have to change going forward.
I appreciate your time here this morning. Dr. Patrick Asuming is an economist with the University of Ghana Business School, leaving us with something to think about this morning while we embark on this IMF program, implement those reforms that will give us the long-lasting desire in terms of our economy. We must begin to have that conversation about the other reforms that will consolidate the gains that we make in that regard. You're watching the AM show with me, Bernice Abubedu-Lansa. When we come back, we will be looking at a history book for primary pupils in Ghana. I would like for you to see it if we have it ready now. To have that book. We don't have it ready now. When we come back, I will be showing you a book which has a portion talking about the disadvantages of Christian missionaries in Ghana, and it cites, for example, or states that religion is the cause of conflict. It talks about Christianity increasing poverty in the country, and also killing the creative minds of people. Let me just let you see that. Okay, so there you have it. The negative effects of Christian missionary activities. Religion is a major cause of physical conflicts and doctrinal disputes in Ghana and the world as a whole. Christianity has led to an increase in poverty. There is a direct link between religion and laziness, which contributes to poverty in Ghana and Africa as a whole. Religion makes people lackadaisical in their attitude towards finding practical ways to improve their undesirable living conditions. Point 3. Some religious doctrines brought by missionaries create a sense of fear or timidity in their adherents. Religion creates an avenue for many tricksters or charlatans to parade as men of God to fleece the poor of their meager resources. 5. Most religious groups discriminate against women in so many ways. 6. Many politicians in Ghana use religion as a vehicle to cause disaffection among people in a bid to advance their political, well, I can see that portion there, but then political interest, thank you. 7. Religion in Ghana does not encourage creativity, invention, or critical thinking because of its conservative or static nature. When we come back, I will be joined by my guest, and obviously, we will be opening the phone line for you to also share your thoughts with us on this matter right after these messages. Do stay.